The two German officers sat in stunned silence as Captain Robert Thompson pulled out his own field rations and quietly divided them into 3 portions. Hans Becker and Friedrich Adler had expected interrogation, beatings, maybe even execution after their capture near the Elbe River in April 1945. Instead, here was this American officer offering them his own food, his own coffee, even lighting a cigarette for them with his own lighter. What they didn't know was that this single act of unexpected kindness would shatter everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about their enemies. What they couldn't predict was how this moment would haunt them for decades, forcing them to confront the humanity they had been trained to deny in others. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of April 15, 1945, began with the thunderous roar of American artillery echoing across the German countryside near the Elbe River. Major Hans Becker crouched behind the crumbling stone wall of what had once been a farmhouse, his weathered face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. At 34, he had seen more warfare than most men twice his age, but nothing had prepared him for this relentless retreat that seemed to have no end. Beside him, Lieutenant Friedrich Adler fumbled with his field radio, desperately trying to establish contact with what remained of their regiment. At 28, Adler still possessed some of the idealistic fervor that had driven him to volunteer for officer training 6 years earlier, though that fire had dimmed considerably over the past months of constant defeat. His hand shook slightly as he adjusted the frequency dial, whether from cold or fear or simple exhaustion, even he couldn't say. "Any word from command?" Becker asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The static crackling from the radio seemed to mock their isolation. Adler shook his head, his blonde hair matted with sweat despite the cool morning air. "Nothing, sir. Just interference. I think we're truly on our own now." The 2 officers represented what little remained of the once mighty German war machine. Becker, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and the brutal Eastern Front, carried himself with the bearing of a professional soldier who had witnessed the gradual transformation of his nation's military from a disciplined force into something he barely recognized. His dark eyes had seen too much, held too many memories of orders that haunted his conscience. Adler, in contrast, had joined the Wehrmacht with dreams of serving the fatherland with honor. His family had celebrated his commission, his mother had sewn his insignia by hand, and his father had presented him with the same ceremonial dagger that had belonged to his grandfather. Now the dagger felt heavy at his side, not with tradition, but with the weight of disillusion. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, and both men knew their time was running short. They had been part of a desperate rearguard action designed to slow the American advance, but their small unit had been separated during a particularly intense bombardment 3 days earlier. Since then, they had been moving eastward, hoping to link up with German forces that might not even exist anymore. "We could try to make it to the woods," Adler suggested, gesturing toward a line of trees roughly half a mile away. "Maybe circle around and find another way across the river." Becker studied the terrain with a tactician's eye. Open ground stretched between their position and the forest, offering no cover whatsoever. American reconnaissance would spot them within minutes, if they hadn't already. Behind them lay the Elbe River, swollen with spring runoff and utterly impassable without a bridge or boat. "Look at us, Friedrich," Becker said quietly, using the young lieutenant's first name in a moment of unexpected intimacy. 2 officers without a unit, without supplies, without even a clear idea of where our own lines are. What exactly are we fighting for at this point? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the burning villages they had passed during their retreat. It was the kind of question that had been whispered in bunkers and trenches for months, but rarely spoken aloud by officers who were expected to maintain morale and discipline, even as their world collapsed around them. Adler's response was interrupted by the distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks approaching from the west. The American advance had caught up with them, and any chance of escape was rapidly disappearing. Through gaps in the crumbling wall, they could see olive-green uniforms moving through the ruins of the village they had occupied just hours earlier. "There." Becker pointed to a group of American soldiers advancing in a tactical formation that spoke of experience and confidence. "3rd Infantry Division. By the look of their patches, they know what they're doing." Unlike many German units that had been hastily thrown together from whatever personnel were available, these Americans moved with the coordination of veterans. Their equipment was well maintained, their communications seemed efficient, and their advance was methodical rather than reckless. It was a sharp contrast to the disorganized retreat that had characterized German operations for months. The reality of their situation settled over both officers like a cold fog. They had perhaps 20 minutes before American patrols would search every building in the area. Their sidearms contained only a few rounds each, hardly enough for any meaningful resistance. More importantly, both men had reached a point where the prospect of continuing to fight seemed less like duty and more like pointless suicide. "My wife is in Hamburg," Adler said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of artillery. "At least, she was the last time I heard from her. That was 6 weeks ago." Becker nodded, understanding the implication. Hamburg had been heavily bombed, and communication with the home front had become increasingly sporadic. For all they knew, the families they were supposedly fighting to protect no longer existed. "I have a sister in Munich," Becker replied. "She's a nurse. Or was. Her hospital was destroyed in February, but I don't know if she—" He left the sentence unfinished, unable to voice his fears. The approaching Americans were close enough now that individual voices could be heard, commands being passed between squad leaders as they secured the village building by building. Their English was crisp and professional, lacking the exhaustion that had crept into German communications over the past months. Adler suddenly stood up, his hands raised above his head, his pistol dangling from one finger by its trigger guard. "I surrender," he called out in heavily accented but understandable English. "We surrender." Becker felt a moment of surprise, not at the decision, but at the relief that flooded through him when his young colleague made the choice that he himself had been unable to voice. Slowly, he too stood, his hands raised, his own weapon held in a gesture of submission. The American soldiers who emerged from the rubble moved with practiced caution, their rifles trained on the 2 German officers, while they barked orders in English. "Hands where we can see them. Drop your weapons. Step forward, slowly." Sergeant Michael Rodriguez was the first to reach them, a stocky man with intelligent eyes, who spoke German well enough to handle the initial interrogation. Behind him came Private Danny Walsh, barely 19, but carrying himself with the confidence of a soldier who had survived multiple campaigns. "Papers," Rodriguez demanded, his rifle still at the ready while Walsh circled behind the prisoners to check for hidden weapons. Becker and Adler produced their identification documents, the small booklets that contained their photographs, rank, and unit assignments. Rodriguez examined them carefully, noting the insignia and attempting to determine what intelligence value these particular prisoners might possess. "Major and Lieutenant," Rodriguez reported to his squad leader. "Look like regular Wehrmacht, not SS. They're probably worth talking to." The distinction mattered, both to the American soldiers and to the prisoners themselves. SS officers could expect harsh treatment, given the growing awareness of atrocities committed by those units. Regular Wehrmacht personnel, while still enemies, were generally treated according to the Geneva Convention provisions for prisoners of war. As they were searched and processed, both German officers were struck by the professional demeanor of their captors. There was no unnecessary roughness, no verbal abuse, no signs of the savage behavior that Nazi propaganda had promised they would encounter. The Americans were efficient, thorough, and impersonal, treating the capture as simply another task to be completed. "You speak English?" Rodriguez asked Becker directly. "Some," Becker replied carefully. His English was better than he let on, learned during peacetime years when he had entertained thoughts of studying abroad. But revealing too much competence in the enemy's language might make him seem more valuable for interrogation than he was prepared to be. Adler remained silent, partly because his English was genuinely limited and partly because he was still processing the surreal nature of their situation. Just hours ago, they had been enemy officers planning defensive positions and calculating fields of fire. Now they were prisoners, dependent on the mercy of men they had been trained to hate. The march to the American command post took roughly 30 minutes through terrain that showed the devastating effects of modern warfare. Destroyed vehicles, both German and American, dotted the landscape like metal tombstones. Artillery craters had turned once fertile farmland into a moonscape of mud and debris. Occasionally, they passed hastily dug graves marked with crude wooden crosses, German and American dead, buried side by whoever had found them first. For Adler, who had spent most of his military service in rear areas handling logistics and communications, the visual evidence of combat's brutality was overwhelming. He had seen bombed cities and destroyed infrastructure, but this intimate destruction, the personal effects scattered around knocked-out tanks, the abandoned equipment that represented individual soldiers' stories, affected him more deeply than he expected. Becker, with his extensive combat experience, noticed different details. The American equipment was universally well-maintained and modern. Their communications worked efficiently. Supply lines were obviously functioning, as evidenced by the quality of the uniforms and the fact that ammunition was being expended freely rather than hoarded. These were signs of a military machine that was functioning at peak efficiency, in stark contrast to the improvised desperation that had characterized German operations for months. The American command post had been established in a partially destroyed church, its Gothic spires serving as convenient landmarks for navigation and radio communication. Camouflage netting draped over the damaged roof provided concealment from aerial observation, while sandbagged positions around the perimeter offered protection against potential counterattacks. Inside, the atmosphere was businesslike but relaxed. Staff officers worked at folding tables covered with maps and reports, while radio operators maintained contact with forward units and higher command. The contrast with German headquarters, which had become increasingly frantic and disorganized, was stark. Captain Robert Thompson looked up from a situation report he had been studying when Sergeant Rodriguez escorted the two prisoners inside. Thompson was 31 years old, a former high school teacher from Ohio who had been drafted 3 years earlier and had worked his way up through the ranks based on competence rather than connections. His face showed the weariness that came from weeks of continuous operations, but his eyes remained alert and thoughtful. "What do we have here, Sergeant?" Thompson asked, setting aside his paperwork to give full attention to the new arrivals. "Major Hans Becker and Lieutenant Friedrich Adler, sir. Wehrmacht, not SS. They surrendered without resistance about an hour ago." Thompson studied the two German officers with the analytical gaze of someone trained to assess people quickly and accurately. He had interrogated dozens of prisoners over the past months, and experience had taught him to look beyond uniforms and ranks to the individuals underneath. Becker met his gaze steadily, his bearing suggesting a professional soldier who maintained discipline even in defeat. Adler seemed younger and more uncertain, his eyes darting around the command post as if trying to understand how he had ended up in this situation. "Sergeant, have someone set up a table outside. I'll speak with them there." Thompson's decision to conduct the initial interview outdoors, rather than in the cramped confines of the church, suggested a preference for a less intimidating atmosphere. As they waited for the furniture to be arranged, Thompson found himself thinking about his own journey to this moment. 3 years earlier, he had been teaching American history to teenagers in Akron, Ohio, trying to make the complexities of the Civil War understandable to students who seemed more interested in baseball and music than in understanding how their nation had been shaped by conflict. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now living through what would undoubtedly become a crucial chapter in the history books he might someday teach again, assuming he survived to return to civilian life. The war in Europe was clearly winding down, but each day still brought new challenges, new decisions, new responsibilities that seemed far removed from the quiet predictability of a classroom. Thompson had learned early in his military service that effective leadership often meant making personal connections with the people under his command, understanding their motivations and fears in order to make decisions that served both mission requirements and human needs. That same approach had proven valuable when dealing with prisoners, who often provided better information when treated as individuals rather than as sources to be exploited. When the table and chairs were ready, Thompson gestured for the two German officers to sit. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the damaged landscape and giving the scene an almost peaceful quality that contrasted sharply with the circumstances that had brought them together. "I'm Captain Thompson," he said in careful German, his pronunciation showing the efforts of someone who had studied the language but was still not entirely comfortable with its complexities. "I understand you are Major Becker and Lieutenant Adler." Both German officers nodded, surprised by the Americans' attempt to speak their language. Most interrogations they had witnessed or heard about were conducted through interpreters, with the questioning officer maintaining a deliberate distance from the prisoners. Thompson pulled out a field ration package, the familiar brown cardboard container that had become synonymous with American military efficiency. Instead of opening it for himself, however, he divided the contents into 3 roughly equal portions, sliding one toward each of the German officers and keeping the third for himself. "You must be hungry," he said, switching back to English, but speaking slowly enough that both men could follow his meaning. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Becker and Adler exchanged glances, uncertainty evident in their expressions. The offer of food was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they had been told about American treatment of prisoners, that neither was sure how to respond. Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of American soldiers as undisciplined savages who tortured prisoners for entertainment and showed no mercy to defeated enemies. Yet here was this American captain, tired from what had obviously been days of continuous operations, sharing his own rations with enemy officers he had never seen before and would probably never see again. The simple humanity of the gesture was more disorienting than any harsh interrogation technique could have been. Thompson opened his portion of the ration and began eating methodically, his actions suggesting that this was simply a practical matter of providing sustenance rather than any calculated psychological technique. He had learned that prisoners who were fed and treated decently were generally more cooperative than those who were intimidated or abused, but his motivations went beyond mere tactical considerations. The captain had been raised in a household where hospitality was considered a fundamental virtue, where guests were fed regardless of the family's own circumstances, and where treating people with basic dignity was seen as a reflection of one's own character. Those values had survived military service and combat experience, perhaps even strengthened by exposure to the dehumanizing aspects of warfare. "Coffee?" Thompson asked, producing a thermos and 3 metal cups from his personal kit. The coffee was strong and bitter, typical of military preparations, but it was hot and caffeinated, providing both physical comfort and psychological reassurance. Adler accepted a cup with trembling hands, though whether the tremor was from fear, exhaustion, or simple cold was impossible to determine. The warmth of the metal against his palms was remarkably comforting, a small but tangible reminder that he was still alive and that basic human needs could still be met even in the most extraordinary circumstances. Becker sipped his coffee slowly, using the time to study his captor more carefully. Thompson's uniform was worn but clean, his equipment well maintained, his demeanor suggesting competence without arrogance. This was clearly an experienced officer who had earned his position through performance rather than politics, the kind of leader that German military tradition would have respected under different circumstances. "Cigarette?" Thompson offered, producing a pack of Lucky Strikes from his shirt pocket. He shook out 3 cigarettes, lit all 3 with the same match, and passed 2 across the table to his prisoners. The ritual of sharing tobacco was universal among soldiers, transcending nationality and ideology. It was a moment of common humanity that acknowledged the stresses and hardships that all military personnel faced, regardless of which flag they served under. For a few minutes, the 3 men sat in companionable silence, smoking and drinking coffee, as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Adler found himself remembering evenings during his training, when officers would gather informally to discuss tactics and strategy, sharing cigarettes and coffee while debating the finer points of military doctrine. The setting was entirely different, but the fundamental human interaction felt remarkably similar. The realization was both comforting and deeply troubling. Thompson finished his cigarette and stubbed it out carefully, then leaned back in his chair and regarded his 2 prisoners with genuine curiosity. "How long have you been in the army?" he asked Becker directly. 14 years, Becker replied after a moment's hesitation. There seemed little point in concealment about basic biographical information, and something in Thompson's manner suggested that honesty might be reciprocated. A career soldier then. I was a teacher before the war. High school history. Thompson's admission was calculated to establish common ground, to demonstrate that he too was a civilian pressed into military service rather than a professional warrior. The revelation surprised both German officers. Thompson's competence and bearing had suggested extensive military experience, but his background as an educator explained the thoughtful approach he was taking to their situation. Teachers, regardless of nationality, shared certain characteristics in dealing with people and problems. "What did you teach?" Adler asked in halting English, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "American history. The Civil War, mostly. How one nation almost destroyed itself fighting over what it meant to be American." Thompson's response carried implications that hung in the air between them, unspoken parallels to Germany's own current situation. As the conversation continued, all three men found themselves navigating the strange territory between their official roles as captor and prisoners and their shared humanity as individuals caught up in events larger than themselves. Thompson asked questions about German tactics and troop dispositions, information that was militarily useful but not particularly sensitive. Becker and Adler answered truthfully but without volunteering details that might compromise other German units. The interrogation, if it could even be called that, felt more like a conversation between colleagues than an adversarial proceeding. Thompson's questions were informed and intelligent, suggesting a genuine interest in understanding German perspectives rather than simply extracting tactical intelligence. His approach revealed a mind that was analytical rather than punitive, curious rather than hostile. "What will happen to us now?" Adler asked, as the formal questioning wound down. Thompson considered the question carefully before answering. "You'll be processed as prisoners of war and sent to a facility in the rear area. The war is almost over, and there are procedures for repatriation once hostilities end officially." The matter-of-fact tone with which Thompson discussed the end of the war struck both German officers forcefully. For months, they'd been hearing increasingly desperate rhetoric from their own leadership about final victories and secret weapons that would turn the tide. To hear an enemy officer speak casually about German defeat as an accomplished fact was jarring, but also oddly liberating. "When do you think it will end?" Becker asked. "Weeks, maybe days. Your government is running out of options." Thompson's assessment was delivered without gloating or satisfaction, simply as a professional evaluation of the military situation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a military policeman who had come to escort the prisoners to the processing center. As Becker and Adler stood to leave, Thompson remained seated, finishing the last of his coffee while observing their departure. "Captain," Becker said, turning back as they reached the edge of the command post area. "Thank you for the meal." Thompson nodded acknowledgement, then returned to the situation reports that required his attention. For him, the encounter had been brief and routine, one of countless interactions he would have with enemy personnel during the final weeks of the war. He would remember the two German officers as professional soldiers who had conducted themselves with dignity, but the meeting would not occupy a prominent place in his memories of the conflict. For Becker and Adler, however, the experience would prove to be transformative in ways they could not yet comprehend. As they walked toward the processing center under guard, both men found themselves grappling with cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions they had held for years. The American soldiers they encountered during processing were efficient and impersonal, but none showed signs of the brutality or sadism that propaganda had led them to expect. Their personal effects were catalogued and stored, rather than confiscated or destroyed. Medical attention was provided for minor injuries and ailments. Food, while basic, was adequate and served regularly. More significantly, they were treated as human beings, rather than as objects of hatred or contempt. Guards addressed them by rank, responded to reasonable requests, and maintained the professional distance that military protocol required without descending into abuse or humiliation. The contrast with their expectations was profound and troubling. During their first night in the temporary holding facility, Adler lay awake on his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent they shared with a dozen other German prisoners. The events of the day played repeatedly through his mind, each detail sharp and vivid in a way that suggested these memories would remain with him for years to come. "Hans," he whispered to the major lying on the next cot. "What if we were wrong about them?" Becker had been wrestling with the same question, though his greater experience and deeper cynicism made him more cautious about drawing conclusions from a single encounter. "One officer sharing his rations doesn't change the nature of war, Friedrich. Thompson seemed decent, but he's still our enemy." But what if he isn't? What if none of them are really? What if we've been fighting people who are fundamentally just like us? The question hung in the darkness between them, unanswerable and deeply unsettling. For young officers who had devoted years of their lives to serving a cause that claimed to represent civilization against barbarism, the possibility that their enemies were neither savage nor evil raised implications too large to process immediately. Becker closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept returning to Thompson's tired but kind expression as he divided his meager rations. 3 ways. The American could easily have interrogated them while they were hungry and disoriented, using their physical discomfort to pressure them for information. Instead, he had chosen to feed them first, to treat them as fellow human beings before addressing military necessities. The approach had been more effective than any harsh technique could have been. Both German officers had answered questions honestly, providing tactical information that could be useful to American forces in subsequent operations. But they had done so not because they were coerced or intimidated, but because Thompson had treated them with the respect that military professionals traditionally showed to worthy adversaries. Over the following days, as they were moved through the prisoner processing system, both Becker and Adler found their worldview continuing to shift in subtle but significant ways. The American guards were generally professional, the medical staff was competent and humane, and the administrative personnel processed their paperwork efficiently without unnecessary delays or harassment. None of this matched the propaganda they had been fed for years about American military behavior. According to Nazi doctrine, they should have been beaten, starved, and forced to perform degrading labor while being subjected to constant racial and political abuse. Instead, they were housed adequately, fed regularly, and treated according to international conventions governing prisoner treatment. The psychological impact was cumulative and profound. Each day brought new evidence that the enemy they had been fighting was composed of ordinary human beings rather than the monsters described in official publications. German propaganda had depicted Americans as racially inferior, culturally degenerate, and militarily incompetent. Yet the reality they experienced suggested competent, disciplined forces led by officers who understood both military necessity and human decency. Lieutenant Adler began keeping a journal, writing in the margins of a book he had been allowed to retain from his personal effects. His entries documented not just the practical details of prison life, but his evolving understanding of the conflict in which he had participated. Day 4, in American custody, he wrote. The guards today were from Minnesota, farm boys who spoke a little German. They had learned from immigrant neighbors. They shared pictures of their families and asked about ours. How can these be the same people we were told to hate and fear? What lies have we believed? What truths have we ignored? Major Becker was less inclined toward written introspection, but his conversations with other prisoners revealed a similar process of reevaluation. Many of the captured German personnel were expressing confusion about the gap between propaganda and reality, questioning not just the wisdom of continuing the war, but the fundamental premises on which it had been justified. The discussions took place carefully and quietly, as even in captivity the habits of political caution remained strong. But the questions being raised struck at the heart of everything they had been taught about their enemies, their cause, and their own role in the conflict that was consuming their nation. 3 weeks after their capture, both officers were transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp in France, where they would spend the remaining months until Germany's formal surrender. The camp housed several thousand German military personnel, from general officers to enlisted men, representing all branches of the armed forces and a wide spectrum of political beliefs. The diversity of perspectives within the camp population led to intense debates about the war, its conduct, and its likely consequences for Germany. Becker and Adler found themselves sharing their experiences with Captain Thompson and the broader treatment they had received from American forces, contributing to a growing awareness among the prisoners that much of what they had been told about their enemies was simply false. These conversations were not academic exercises. The war crimes trials that would follow Germany's surrender were already being discussed, and many prisoners were beginning to understand that they would need to account for their actions during the conflict. The realization that their enemies were capable of justice and mercy rather than simple revenge provided some hope that post-war Germany might have a future beyond the destruction that currently surrounded them. For Becker, who had served on the Eastern Front and witnessed atrocities committed by German forces against civilian populations, the contrast between German behavior and American treatment of prisoners was one particularly stark. He had seen his own countrymen commit acts that violated every principle of military honor and human decency, justified by ideology that portrayed entire populations as subhuman threats to German survival. Yet here he was, being treated humanely by enemies who had every reason to seek revenge for the destruction German forces had brought to Europe. The irony was both humbling and deeply troubling, forcing him to confront the possibility that he had served a cause that was fundamentally evil rather than simply misguided. Adler's struggle was different, but equally profound. He had joined the Wehrmacht out of patriotism and a desire to serve his country honorably, believing that German military tradition represented the highest ideals of professional soldiering. The gradual realization that this tradition had been perverted and corrupted by Nazi ideology left him questioning not just his recent service, but his entire understanding of duty and honor. The months in captivity passed slowly, marked by routine duties, educational programs organized by the camp administration, and endless discussions among prisoners about what had gone wrong and how Germany might recover from the catastrophe that was unfolding around them. News from the shrinking Reich was increasingly grim, confirming American predictions about the war's imminent end, while revealing the full extent of destruction being inflicted on German cities and civilians. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the reaction in the prison camp was mixed. Relief that the killing would finally end, combined with despair about what defeat would mean for their families and their nation. The formal end of hostilities brought new uncertainties about repatriation, reconstruction, and individual responsibility for the events of the past 6 years. Both Becker and Adler were eventually released and returned to Germany in 1947, part of the gradual repatriation process that brought millions of German prisoners back to a homeland that had been transformed by defeat and occupation. They found a country that bore little resemblance to the one they had left, its cities destroyed, its population traumatized, and its future uncertain. The skills they had learned in the military proved valuable in the reconstruction effort, and both men found employment in the rebuilding German economy. Becker became a construction supervisor, helping to rebuild the infrastructure that the war had destroyed. Adler used his organizational abilities in the refugee resettlement program, helping displaced persons find housing and employment in their shattered homeland. But neither man ever forgot the American captain who had shared his rations with enemy prisoners on a spring afternoon in 1945. The memory of Thompson's simple act of human kindness remained vivid decades later, a symbol of the possibility that enemies could recognize each other's humanity even in the midst of total war. Becker eventually wrote about his experiences in a memoir published in the 1980s, describing how encountering American decency had forced him to confront the moral failures of the cause he had served. His book became part of the broader German effort to understand and come to terms with the Nazi period, contributing to the national conversation about responsibility, guilt, and reconciliation. Adler became a teacher, following in some ways the path that Thompson had taken before the war. He taught history to German students, emphasizing the importance of questioning propaganda and maintaining critical thinking even in times of national crisis. His classes included detailed discussions of the war and its aftermath, drawing on his personal experiences to illustrate the human cost of political extremism. Both men attempted to contact Thompson after the war, hoping to express their gratitude and perhaps maintain a correspondence that might help them process their wartime experiences. They learned that he had returned to Ohio and resumed his teaching career, but their letters were never answered. Whether Thompson received them or simply chose not to respond remained unknown. The captain's silence did not diminish the impact of his actions. For Becker and Adler, the encounter had served as a catalyst for a fundamental reevaluation of their beliefs and assumptions. The simple act of sharing food had demonstrated that enemies could retain their humanity even in the midst of ideological conflict, and that individual choices about how to treat other people remained meaningful even when larger political forces seemed to mandate hatred and dehumanization. In their later years, both men spoke frequently about the lessons they had learned from defeat and captivity. They emphasized to their children and grandchildren that propaganda, regardless of its source, should be viewed with skepticism, and that the humanity of other people should never be denied regardless of political or military circumstances. The story of their encounter with Captain Thompson became a family legend, told and retold at holidays and gatherings as an illustration of how individual acts of kindness could transcend the artificial barriers created by war and politics. The details might vary slightly in the telling, but the essential message remained constant. Even in the darkest times, people retained the capacity to choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, and humanity over ideology. For Thompson himself, the encounter with the two German officers was probably forgotten within days. Eclipsed by the continuing demands of military service and the hundreds of other interactions he had with enemy personnel during the final weeks of the war. He never knew that his simple decision to share his rations had profoundly affected 2 lives and, through them, influenced the thinking of countless others who heard the story over the subsequent decades. The captain returned to civilian life and resumed teaching, spending the next 30 years educating American students about their nation's history and the importance of democratic values. He rarely spoke about his military service, preferring to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. When he retired in 1975, his contribution to the war effort was honored but not considered extraordinary by the standards of his generation. Yet in the lives of Hans Becker and Friedrich Adler, Thompson's brief act of kindness had consequences that rippled outward for decades. Their children grow up hearing about the American captain who had treated enemy prisoners with dignity and respect. Their students learned about the importance of maintaining humanity even in times of conflict. Their memoirs and lectures contributed to Germany's ongoing effort to understand and learn from its darkest period. The encounter near the Elbe River in April 1945 lasted perhaps 2 hours, a fleeting moment in the vast scope of World War II. But for the 2 German officers who experienced it, those hours represented a turning point that shaped the rest of their lives, demonstrating that even in total war, individual human choices could create moments of grace that transcended the hatred and violence surrounding them. In the end, the story became more than just a personal memory or family anecdote. It represented a small but significant example of how ordinary people could choose to act with decency and compassion, even when such behavior seemed to serve no strategic purpose and might even be seen as contrary to military necessity. Thompson's decision to share his rations with enemy prisoners demonstrated that humanity could survive even in circumstances designed to eliminate it, and that individual choices about how to treat other people remained meaningful even when larger forces seemed to mandate dehumanization. The legacy of that afternoon continued long after all the participants had died, passed down through families and preserved in memoirs and historical accounts. It served as a reminder that war, despite its capacity for bringing out the worst in human nature, could not entirely eliminate the possibility of kindness, compassion, and mutual recognition of shared humanity between enemies. The story of Captain Thompson and the 2 German officers became part of the larger narrative of World War II, a conflict that demonstrated both the depths to which civilized nations could sink and the heights of moral courage that individuals could achieve even in the most desperate circumstances. It illustrated that while war might be inevitable and sometimes necessary, the choice of how to conduct oneself during conflict remained a matter of individual conscience and character. Years later, when historians studied the final collapse of Nazi Germany, they would note that the humane treatment of German prisoners by Allied forces had contributed to the relatively peaceful occupation and reconstruction that followed the war's end. The decision to treat defeated enemies with dignity rather than seeking revenge had helped create the foundation for the democratic, prosperous Germany that emerged from the ruins of the Third Reich. But for Hans Becker and Friedrich Adler, the broader historical significance was less important than the personal transformation they had experienced. The American captain who shared his rations with enemy prisoners had shown them that it was possible to maintain one's humanity even in the midst of total war. And that simple acts of kindness could transcend the artificial barriers created by politics and ideology. That lesson, learned on a spring afternoon in 1945, remained with them for the rest of their lives, shaping their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world too often marked by inhumanity. In 1968, 23 years after their encounter with Captain Thompson, a remarkable coincidence brought the memory of that day rushing back with unprecedented clarity. Hans Becker, now a successful construction company owner in Stuttgart, was attending an international conference on post-war reconstruction when he noticed a familiar name on the conference roster. Robert Thompson, listed as a professor of European history at Ohio State University, was scheduled to deliver a presentation on American military governance in occupied Germany. Becker felt his heart racing as he read the program details. The biographical information matched perfectly, the age was correct, and the academic focus on European affairs seemed consistent with the thoughtful officer he remembered from that spring afternoon so many years ago. The possibility that this might be the same man who had shared his rations with enemy prisoners seemed almost too incredible to believe, yet the evidence was compelling. The lecture hall was packed with academics, government officials, and business leaders from across Europe and North America. When Thompson took the podium, Becker recognized him immediately, despite the passage of time. The face was older, lined with the marks of middle age, but the intelligent eyes and thoughtful demeanor were unmistakable. This was definitely the American captain who had treated two defeated German officers with unexpected kindness. Thompson's presentation was masterful, demonstrating deep understanding of the complexities involved in rebuilding a nation while maintaining democratic principles and human dignity. He spoke about the importance of treating former enemies as future allies, of showing mercy without ignoring justice, and of building bridges across the divisions created by war and ideology. His words resonated powerfully with an audience that included many people who had lived through the occupation period. During the question and answer session, Becker found himself rising from his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. "Professor Thompson," he began in careful English that still carried traces of his German accent, "I want to ask you about a specific incident that occurred near the Elbe River in April 1945. Thompson paused, his expression showing polite attention, but no immediate recognition. The lecture hall fell silent as Becker continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "You were a captain then, and you shared your field rations with two German officers you had taken prisoner. One was a major named Hans Becker. The other was a lieutenant named Friedrich Adler. I am Hans Becker." The silence in the auditorium was profound, hundreds of people witnessing this unexpected reunion between former enemies. Thompson stared at Becker for several long seconds, his expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been wonder. "My God," Thompson said finally, his voice barely audible through the microphone. "I remember. You were the major with the engineering background. You spoke some English but pretended not to understand much." Becker smiled, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "You gave us coffee and cigarettes. You treated us like human beings when we expected to be treated like animals. That afternoon changed my life. Professor Thompson, it changed everything I believed about Americans, about enemies, about what it means to maintain humanity during war." End quote. The audience was completely captivated by this impromptu reunion, many people leaning forward in their seats to catch every word. Several conference organizers were frantically taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance. Thompson stepped away from the podium and walked down into the audience, approaching Becker with an expression of genuine amazement. "I never knew," he said as they shook hands. then embraced briefly in the manner of old soldiers meeting after long separation. "I never knew that afternoon meant anything to you. It seemed like the right thing to do." "That's exactly why it mattered so much," Becker replied. "You didn't do it for strategy or propaganda or because someone ordered you to. You did it because you saw us as human beings who are hungry and tired and far from home. That simple recognition of our humanity destroyed years of propaganda about American brutality." The conference organizers quickly rearranged the schedule to allow Thompson and Becker to have an extended conversation on stage. Recognizing the educational value of their dialogue for the assembled audience, what followed was an extraordinary discussion between former WWII enemies who had found common ground in their shared commitment to human dignity. Thompson spoke about his philosophy as a military officer, explaining how his background as a teacher had influenced his approach to dealing with prisoners and civilians. He had seen military service as an extension of education, an opportunity to demonstrate American values through actions rather than words. The decision to share his rations with German prisoners had been instinctive, based on principles his parents had taught him about hospitality and basic human decency. Becker described the psychological impact of that encounter, how it had forced him to question everything he had been taught about American soldiers and, by extension, about the entire ideological framework that had justified German aggression. The simple act of kindness had been more effective than any interrogation technique could have been. Not because it extracted information, but because it transformed understanding. The audience was deeply moved by this dialogue, many people wiping away tears as they listened to two former enemies discuss how a moment of human compassion had transcended the hatred and violence of war. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, touching on themes of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the responsibility of individuals to maintain moral principles even in extreme circumstances. After the formal session ended, Thompson and Becker continued their conversation privately, sharing details about their families, their careers, and their perspectives on the changes that had occurred in both their countries since the war. Becker learned that Thompson had indeed received his letters in the late 1940s but had been unable to respond due to military regulations that discouraged contact between former captors and prisoners. "I wanted to write back," Thompson explained. "Your letters were thoughtful and moving. But the Army had policies about maintaining professional distance, and I was advised that correspondence might be misinterpreted or cause problems for both of us. I've regretted that silence for 20 years. Becker nodded understandingly. "I thought perhaps the letters had been lost, or that you simply preferred not to be reminded of the war. I never imagined there were official barriers preventing response." The two men exchanged contact information and promised to maintain correspondence now that military regulations no longer applied. Their reunion had been brief but profoundly meaningful, providing closure to an encounter that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. News of the reunion spread quickly through academic and veteran communities on both sides of the Atlantic. Newspapers picked up the story, presenting it as an example of how former enemies could find common ground and mutual respect decades after the end of hostilities. Television interviews followed, with both men appearing on programs dedicated to war memories and international reconciliation. Friedrich Adler, now a respected history teacher in Munich, learned about the reunion through a newspaper article that featured photographs of Thompson and Becker embracing at the conference. The sight of his former commanding officer, reunited with the American captain, brought back vivid memories of that afternoon near the Elbe River and the profound impact it had on his own worldview. Adler immediately wrote to both men, expressing his joy at learning about their reunion and sharing his own memories of the encounter. His letter described how Thompson's kindness had influenced his approach to teaching, inspiring him to emphasize the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their nationality, religion, or political beliefs. The correspondence that developed between the three men became a richer exploration of memory, morality, and the long-term consequences of individual actions during wartime. Thompson was amazed to learn how deeply his simple gesture had affected both German officers, while Becker and Adler were grateful to finally express their appreciation to the American who had shown them such unexpected kindness. Their letters were eventually compiled into a book published in both English and German Das, titled Beyond the Uniform: Letters Between Former Enemies. The book became a bestseller in both countries, resonating with readers who were interested in personal stories of reconciliation and the human dimension of historical events. The success of the book led to speaking engagements at universities, military academies, and international conferences. The three men found themselves in demand as speakers who could provide first-hand testimony about the possibility of maintaining humanity, even in the midst of total war. Their presentations were particularly popular with military audiences, who appreciated the tactical lesson that treating enemies with dignity often produced better results than harsh interrogation. Methods. Thompson's reunion with his former prisoners also had unexpected consequences in his personal life. His grown children, who had rarely heard their father discuss his military service, were fascinated to learn about the impact his wartime actions had on other people's lives. The story became a source of family pride and helped bridge generational differences about the meaning and value of military bacon. Service. His students at Ohio State University were equally impressed by the revelation that their professor had played a small but significant role in promoting post-war reconciliation through individual acts of kindness. Thompson began incorporating the story into his lectures, using it to illustrate how ordinary people could influence historical events through moral choices that seemed insignificant at the time. For Becker, the reunion provided validation for decisions he had made throughout his post-war career. His construction company had become known for its willingness to hire former prisoners of war and refugees, often providing training and support for people who had difficulty finding employment elsewhere. He had never explicitly connected this policy to his wartime encounter with Thompson, but the reunion helped him recognize the continuity between that moment of received kindness and his subsequent commitment to helping others. Adler found similar validation in his teaching methods, which emphasized critical thinking and skepticism toward propaganda, regardless of its source. His students learned not just historical facts, but analytical skills that would help them evaluate, quote, information and resist manipulation throughout their lives. The reunion with Thompson reinforced his conviction that education should focus on developing character as well as knowledge. The three men met in person several more times over the following years, their friendship deepening despite the geographical distance and cultural differences that separated them. They attended each other's retirement celebrations, corresponded regularly about world events, and collaborated on articles and presentations about military ethics and international reconciliation. Their friendship became a symbol of the IDA, broader reconciliation between Germany and the United States that had transformed both countries since the war. Former enemies had become allies, trading partners, and partners in promoting democracy and human rights around the world. The personal relationship between Thompson, Becker, and Adler embodied this larger transformation on an individual level. In 1975, 30 years after their original encounter, the three men returned together to the site near the Elbe River where they had first met. The area had been transformed by post-war development, but they were able to locate the approximate spot where Thompson had shared his rations with the two German prisoners, standing in the same location where their lives had been changed decades earlier. The three elderly men reflected on the journey that had brought them back together as friends rather than enemies. The moment was deeply emotional for all of them, a recognition of how far they had traveled both physically and spiritually since that spring afternoon in 1945. Thompson, now retired from teaching, spoke about the lessons he had learned from their long correspondence. You taught me that small actions can have consequences that extend far beyond what we can imagine at the time. That afternoon, I was just trying to do what seemed right. I never dreamed it would matter to you for 30 years, or that it would eventually bring us together as friends. Becker, successful in business and respected in his community, reflected on the transformation in his thinking that had begun with Thompson's simple kindness. You showed me that propaganda lies, that enemies can be human beings, that individual choices matter even in the midst of systematic evil. Everything I've tried to do since the war has been influenced by the lesson you taught me that day. Adler, who had recently retired from teaching, emphasized the educational value of their story. We've told this story to thousands of students and soldiers over the years. The message is always the same, that maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances is possible and necessary. That one person choosing kindness over cruelty can change the world in small but significant ways. Their return to the site of their original encounter was filmed by a documentary crew, and the resulting program was broadcast in several countries as an example of reconciliation and the power of individual moral choices. The film included interviews with their family members, students, and colleagues, demonstrating how their friendship had influenced countless other people over the decades. The documentary also featured historical analysis by military historians and psychologists who explained the broader WWII's significance of the encounter in terms of military ethics, prisoner treatment, and the psychology of enemy perception during wartime. Academic experts praised the three men for their willingness to share their story and their commitment to promoting understanding between former adversaries. As the three men entered their final years, their friendship became even more precious to each of them. They had shared experiences that few other people could understand, having lived through one of history's most devastating conflicts, and found in each other proof that humanity could survive even the most extreme circumstances. Thompson passed away in 1982, surrounded by family members who had grown up hearing stories about his friendship with the two German officers. His funeral was attended by colleagues, former students, and representatives from the German government who wanted to honor his contribution to international reconciliation. Becker and Adler served as honorary pallbearers, their presence symbolizing the transformation that had occurred in German-American relations over the preceding decades. Becker died 3 years later, having lived to see his construction company become one of the most respected firms in southern Germany. His obituary mentioned his military service and business success, but devoted significant space to his friendship with the American officer who had treated him with kindness when he was a defeated enemy prisoner. Adler survived until 1990. Long enough to witness the reunification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. His final years were spent writing and speaking about the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of political circumstances. His last public appearance was at a conference on Holocaust education, where he emphasized that recognition of shared humanity was the only reliable protection against genocide and other systematic atrocities. The deaths of the three men marked the end of a remarkable friendship, but their story continued to influence people around the world. Their correspondence was preserved in archives at multiple universities, providing raw material for researchers studying reconciliation, military ethics, and the psychology of conflict resolution. Military academies in both the United States and Germany incorporated their story into curricula on leadership and ethics, using it to illustrate how individual officers could promote national interests through demonstrating respect for enemy personnel. The lesson was particularly relevant for modern military operations, where soldiers often had to interact with civilian populations and former adversaries in complex peacekeeping and nation-building missions. Their story also became part of educational programs in secondary schools, where teachers used it to help students understand that historical events were shaped by individual human choices, as well as subterra, by large political and economic forces. The personal dimension of the story made abstract concepts like reconciliation and international cooperation more concrete and meaningful for young people. The reunion between Thompson and his former prisoners became a case study in conflict resolution programs, demonstrating how former enemies could find common ground through honest dialogue and mutual respect. Diplomatic training programs used their correspondence as an example of how personal relationships could complement official negotiations in building lasting peace between nations. Religious organizations also embraced their story as an example of forgiveness and redemption, showing how people could transcend hatred and build bridges across the divisions created by war and ideology. Their friendship became a modern parable about the possibility of transformation and the power of individual moral choices to create positive change in the world. The legacy of that spring afternoon in 1945 continued to ripple outward through the lives of people who had never met any of the three men, but were inspired by their story to make their own choices about how to treat others. especially those who might be considered enemies or outsiders. Teachers, soldiers, diplomats, and ordinary citizens found in their example a model for maintaining humanity in difficult circumstances and working toward reconciliation rather than revenge. The simple act of sharing rations with enemy prisoners had become something much larger, a symbol of hope that human kindness could transcend even the most extreme forms of political conflict, and that individual choices about treating other people with dignity remained meaningful regardless of larger circumstances. The story proved that history was shaped not just by the decisions of political leaders and military commanders, but also by countless small acts of decency performed by ordinary people who chose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, and humanity over ideology. In the decades following the deaths of all three men, their story took on new dimensions as subsequent generations discovered different meanings and applications for the lessons they had taught. The children and grandchildren of Thompson, Becker, and Adler became custodians of their legacy, working to preserve their correspondence, maintain their memory, and continue spreading their message of reconciliation and human dignity. Thompson's daughter Sarah, who had become a social worker specializing in refugee resettlement, found herself drawing on her father's example when working with people who had fled violence and persecution in their home countries. The refugees she helped often arrived deeply suspicious of Americans, having been taught by their own governments or extremist groups that the United States was hostile to their religion or culture. Sarah discovered that her father's approach of offering practical help first, before addressing political or ideological differences, was remarkably effective in building trust with frightened and traumatized families. During one particularly challenging case involving a family of Syrian refugees in 2015, Sarah found herself thinking about her father's encounter with the German officers. The father of the Syrian family had been a government official before the Civil War and harbored deep resentment against American foreign policy in the Middle East. His wife wore traditional Islamic dress and spoke no English, while their teenage children struggled with anger and confusion about leaving everything they had known behind. Sarah's approach mirrored her father's instinctive kindness 70 years earlier. Instead of launching immediately into discussions about American legal procedures or cultural expectations, she began by simply ensuring the family had adequate food, clothing, and medical care. She helped them navigate the complex bureaucracy of social services, accompanied them to doctor appointments, and found Arabic-speaking volunteers who could provide translation and cultural guidance. The breakthrough came when Sarah brought homemade soup to the family during a particularly difficult week when the mother had fallen ill. The gesture was so simple, so universally understood across cultural boundaries, that it dissolved much of the suspicion and hostility the family had been carrying. The Syrian father later told an interviewer that this moment had changed his entire perception of Americans, demonstrating that individual kindness could transcend political divisions and cultural misunderstandings. Sarah began incorporating her grandfather's story into her professional training sessions for other social workers and refugee advocates. She found that the tale of sharing rations with enemy prisoners provided a powerful framework for understanding how small acts of humanity could break through barriers created by propaganda, fear, and political manipulation. The historical distance of the World War II setting made the lessons more palatable for audiences who might otherwise resist contemporary political parallels. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hans Becker's grandson Michael had become a documentary filmmaker specializing in stories about post-war reconciliation and international cooperation. His work took him to conflict zones around the world, where he documented efforts to build peace between former enemies and create understanding across ethnic, religious, and political divides. Michael's most acclaimed film, released in 2010, examined the role of individual actions in promoting reconciliation in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Northern Ireland. The documentary featured interviews with former combatants who had learned to work together for peace, aid workers who had risked their lives to help people on all sides of conflicts, and ordinary citizens who had chosen forgiveness over revenge after experiencing terrible losses. The film opened with the story of his grandfather's encounter with Captain Thompson, using their eventual friendship as a template for understanding how personal relationships could transcend political divisions. Michael had interviewed dozens of people whose lives had been changed by unexpected kindness from supposed enemies, finding that the pattern established by Thompson, Becker, and Adler was repeated in conflicts around the world. One particularly moving segment of the documentary featured a former Hutu militia member and a Tutsi survivor of the Rwandan genocide who had become close friends while working together on a reconciliation project. Their relationship had begun when the Hutu man, now imprisoned for his crimes, had shared his meager prison rations with the Tutsi man, who was visiting the prison as part of a dialogue program. The echo of Thompson's gesture was unmistakable, demonstrating that the impulse toward kindness could emerge even in the aftermath of humanity's darkest chapters. Friedrich Adler's legacy lived on through the educational foundation established in his name, which promoted teaching methods that emphasized critical thinking, cultural understanding, and resistance to propaganda. The foundation provided grants for teachers who developed innovative curricula dealing with conflict resolution, human rights, and international cooperation. One recipient of an Adler Foundation grant was Maria Santos, a high school history teacher in Los Angeles, who worked with students from diverse immigrant backgrounds, many of whom came from families that had fled violence or persecution in their home countries. Maria discovered that many of her students harbored prejudices against other ethnic groups based on conflicts in their countries of origin, creating tensions that sometimes erupted into serious problems at school. Maria developed a curriculum based on the Thompson-Becker-Adler story that challenged students to examine their own assumptions about people from different backgrounds. The program began with historical examples of reconciliation between former enemies, then moved to contemporary case studies of successful cooperation across ethnic and religious lines. The most powerful component of Maria's program was a simulation exercise, where students were randomly assigned to represent different sides in historical conflicts, then had to work together to find solutions that addressed everyone's needs. The exercise consistently produced moments of recognition when students realized that people they had been taught to consider enemies were actually facing similar challenges and sharing similar hopes for their families' futures. One particularly memorable session involved students from Armenian and Turkish families who had inherited their grandparents' animosity over the Armenian genocide. Through the simulation exercise and subsequent discussions, they discovered that both their families had experienced displacement, loss, and trauma, even if the historical circumstances were different. The Turkish student later wrote in his final paper that the program had taught him to see the humanity in people he had been raised to consider enemies, directly echoing the transformation that Becker and Adler had experienced decades earlier. The influence of the original story continued to spread through unexpected channels. Military chaplains from various denominations found that the account of Thompson's kindness provided a powerful illustration for discussions about maintaining moral principles during combat operations. The story was particularly relevant for soldiers serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the lines between enemy combatants and civilian populations were often unclear, and where individual actions could have strategic consequences for American objectives. Chaplain David Rodriguez, serving with Marines in Afghanistan's Helmand province in 2011, regularly used the Thompson story in his sessions with young soldiers who were struggling with the moral complexities of counterinsurgency warfare. Many of his Marines had joined the military after the September 11th attacks, motivated by anger and a desire for revenge against Islamic extremists. Rodriguez found that the historical example of treating German prisoners with dignity helped his Marines understand that showing humanity toward Afghan civilians and even captured Taliban fighters could serve both, quote, moral and tactical purposes. Several Marines later reported that remembering Thompson's example had influenced their decisions during difficult encounters with local populations, helping them choose de-escalation over violence when situations became tense. The story also found new relevance in corporate training programs focused on conflict resolution and international business relationships. Multinational corporations operating in politically sensitive regions discovered that the principles demonstrated by Thompson's treatment of his prisoners provided valuable guidance for employees working across cultural and political boundaries. Jennifer Walsh, a human resources executive for a major technology company with operations in dozens of countries, incorporated the Thompson Becker Adler story into training programs for employees assigned to international postings. The historical example helped American executives understand that business success in foreign markets often depended on demonstrating respect for local cultures and finding common ground with partners who might hold very different political views. One particularly successful application occurred when Walsh's company was negotiating a joint venture with a Chinese technology firm whose executives were initially suspicious of American motives and methods. The American negotiating team, trained in the principles illustrated by Thompson's story, began their meetings not with aggressive sales presentations, but with genuine efforts to understand their Chinese counterparts' concerns and objectives. The breakthrough came when the American team leader shared his own lunch with Chinese executives during a long negotiating session, a gesture that was interpreted as showing respect and hospitality rather than attempting to gain tactical advantage. The Chinese executives later said that this moment had convinced them that the Americans were genuinely interested in building a mutually beneficial relationship rather than simply exploiting Chinese resources or markets. Academic researchers studying the psychology of conflict and reconciliation found that the Thompson-Becker Adler case provided valuable insights into the mechanisms through which individual actions could influence group dynamics and political relationships. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a social psychologist at Stanford University, conducted extensive research on what she termed micro-reconciliation, the process by which small personal gestures could create, quote, openings for larger political transformations. Chen's research team interviewed hundreds of people who had experienced positive interactions with members of groups they had been taught to consider enemies. The pattern that emerged consistently paralleled the German officer's experience with Captain Thompson. Initial surprise at humane treatment, followed by cognitive dissonance as preconceptions were challenged, then gradual reevaluation of broader assumptions about the supposed enemy group. The research found that these individual transformations could have significant ripple effects when people shared their experiences with family members, friends, and colleagues. Chen calculated that Thompson's simple gesture of sharing rations had directly influenced the thinking of thousands of people over the subsequent decades. As Becker and Adler told their story to students, fellow prisoners, family members, and eventually to audiences around the world. Even more significantly, Chen's research demonstrated that people who experienced unexpected kindness from supposed enemies were much more likely to extend similar treatment to others in comparable situations. The kindness became contagious, spreading through social networks and across generations in ways that could be measured and documented. The academic validation of the Thompson-Becker Adler model led to its incorporation into formal peace-building programs in conflict zones around the world. International organizations working in places like Colombia, Sri Lanka, and the Democratic Republic of Congo began training local leaders to look for opportunities to demonstrate humanity and kindness toward members of opposing groups, using the historical example as a template for creating trust across political divides. In Colombia, where a decades-long civil war between government forces and leftist guerrillas had created deep social divisions, peace negotiators found that the Thompson model provided a framework for understanding how former enemies could begin working together. Community leaders on both sides of the conflict were trained to recognize opportunities for small gestures that could demonstrate good faith and begin building relationships across political boundaries. One particularly successful application occurred in a rural region where former guerrilla fighters were being reintegrated into civilian communities that had suffered greatly during the conflict. Instead of immediately addressing complex political and economic issues, mediators focused on creating opportunities for former enemies to demonstrate kindness and respect for each other through simple human interactions. The breakthrough came during a community meeting when a former guerrilla commander offered to share his lunch with a local farmer whose crops had been destroyed during the fighting. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the atmosphere of suspicion and hostility that had dominated the region, that it created space for genuine dialogue about how the community could move forward together. The farmer later said that this moment had convinced him that some former guerrilla fighters might genuinely want to contribute to peace, rather than simply avoiding punishment for their wartime actions. The commander, in turn, said that the farmer's acceptance of his offer had given him hope that civilian communities might be willing to give former combatants a chance to prove their commitment to peaceful coexistence. As the story of Thompson, Becker, and Adler entered its 8th decade, new generations continued to discover fresh and now applications for the lessons it taught about maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances, building bridges across political divisions, and recognizing the common humanity that exists even between supposed enemies. The simple act of sharing rations had become a timeless example of how individual choices about treating other people with dignity could create ripple effects that extended far beyond what anyone could predict or imagine.